Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to get started. I hope you're all doing well, and I hope that if you're watching this live, that you managed to have a good break over the weekend. My name is Katie Jacobs. I work at the CIPD. My focus is HR leaders, but I've also been hosting the CIPD's Coronavirus webinar series. And this afternoon, we're going to be discussing how HR professionals can best look after people who are working from home during this pandemic. Joining me today, I'm delighted we've got a really fantastic panel. If we go to the next slide, you can see who they are. We've got Peter Cheese, CEO of the CIPD. We've got Kerry Cooper, Professor of Organisational Psychology at Manchester Business School. He's also CIPD President and an all-round wellbeing guru. We've got Helen Matthews, Chief People Officer at advertising agency Ogilvy, and Andrew Willis, Head of Legal and Advisory at HR Inform, the CIPD's employment law resource. And as ever, Andrew is reliably on hand to provide the answers to any tricky legal questions. Now, before we dive into the topic this afternoon, just going to do some quick housekeeping. Please be aware that this session will be recorded. It will be available on demand via the webinar section of the CIPD website. Please do feel free to share it with your peers and colleagues. You can also access recordings of our previous webinars there and sign up for future sessions. We're running 2 webinars a week at the moment on all sorts of coronavirus related topics. Now, if you want to submit questions during the webinar, could I ask you please to use the Q&A tab, which you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen. Please don't use the chat box for questions. We don't tend to monitor the chat box, and it's a little bit distracting if it pops up all the time. All attendees are muted, so any questions need to be submitted by typing them into the Q&A box. And we're also going to be addressing some questions that we got submitted in advance. Just a reminder that for any legal advice, CIPD members can call our HR Inform helpline. That's available 24/7, and you will get an individual response. And we're updating the FAQs and the resources on our website all the time as new information becomes available. You can head to the CIPD Coronavirus Hub for more. So let's get started. COVID-19 has brought on a mass enforced working from home experiment. Anyone who's not classed as a key worker has been working from home for well over a month now. And we're all in different situations, from those of us balancing working at home with caring responsibilities to those living alone and feeling increasingly isolated as lockdown continues. For many of us, lockdown is having an impact on many aspects of our well-being, from our physical and mental health to areas like social and financial well-being. So how can HR teams best support the health and well-being of people working remotely, keeping people happy, healthy, and engaged, and creating the best conditions for performance, even in this truly bizarre and unprecedented situation? That's what our experts are going to consider today, offering practical advice and contextualized examples. So I'll just quickly take you through the running order. First up, Peter's going to set some context, and he's going to share some thoughts about the value of prioritizing well-being for the people profession. After that, Kerry will give a short presentation on supporting well-being remotely, including offering top tips for working remotely personally and for managing remote workers. Helen will then give a case study, sharing what Ogilvy are doing to support well-being among its remote workforce. And we're then going to move on to Q&A. And Andrew will be on hand as well in case any of those questions need a legal perspective. So I'm going to mute myself now. I'm going to hand over to Peter to give a bit more of the context. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Katie, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you again for joining this webinar, and also a huge thanks to Carrie and to Helen for joining us on this, and Andrew, as always, providing the legal guidance on some of the questions that may come up. As Katie said, that we are in what has been described as the biggest home working experiment ever. I was just reflecting on some of the ONS stats that were recently published on how things have changed across the workforce over these last few months. And they estimate that almost half the workforce is now working from home. I think our experience might suggest it's even slightly higher than that, but it's interesting to compare it to the stats from previously, which was 1 in 20. So it's not like remote working is an entirely new phenomenon, but it's very clear this is much, much bigger than anything we've experienced before. It does, of course, and that incidentally amounts to about 14 to 15 million workers. It does vary across sectors. So we know, and I find this quite interesting, that many of the essential jobs that are performed in the economy, as we now understand them, of course, are not jobs that are easily done working remotely. So it does vary across sectors, and there's big variation in places like financial services versus obviously things like healthcare. Something like a quarter of businesses are temporarily closed. And from our own surveys, over 50% of organizations, and we're going to see what that really does turn out today with the opening of the portal by HMRC, but over 50% of organizations expecting to furlough or have done some furlough. But there are also, of course, many organizations reducing staff levels and decreasing hours. So it's not like furloughing is the only way to respond to all of this. But there are still many businesses who are saying that they are carrying on, and some, of course, seeing massively increased demand as well. So this whole debate about how we're supporting remote workers, how the crisis is affecting different organizations, of course, there are lots of different pictures and lots of different stories. And the other big part of this, and the challenge that government, of course, is facing all the time, is how to triage, if you will, between protecting us all, not constraining movement, so that we can protect our people more, from the social issues, which we'll talk about a bit perhaps in all of this. So not only are we in remote working, but we are in remote working in some pretty peculiar circumstances, with the lockdown of social movements and other things. And of course, the effect on the economy, which is profound already, and a lot of the estimates on the economic impact of this are huge and unprecedented. 10, 20, 30% drops in GDP in a short period of time. And even though most economists expect us to recover once the lockdowns begin to lift to some level, there will still be a sustained economic impact and many jobs lost during this crisis. So to frame it also in what's important, I mean, well-being for us has always been a very central subject. We have often talked about well-being as being one of the most important outcomes of work. And even if I go back to the history of the CIPD, as some of you may recall, we were the Welfare Workers Association, started over just over 100 years ago in organizations like Roundtree and Cadbury's and Lever Brothers and so on, all organizations which are still here today, where they seem to put the idea of the workers' welfare and well-being very much central to their philosophy of work. And arguably, we lost sight of an awful lot of that in recent decades, when it seemed to be that what we most reflected on, particularly in quoted companies and private enterprise, was more about productivity and making money, rather than necessarily how well we're looking after our people. So this crisis is, I think, in a positive way, in many ways, has certainly called out this idea of well-being much more strongly. And from our own surveys, again, we know that it's top of the list of many organizations concerned. So about 70% of people that we've surveyed said this is top of their list in terms of the challenges which they're needing to address and understand they need to address, is how they support their workers in these very difficult times. And in particular, how they support people when they're remote working. And although, as I said at the beginning, some people have had experience of remote working, we shouldn't forget that. Most people haven't. And indeed, we've lived through a long culture in business of presenteeism, where many people may have been able to work from home, but are concerned because the cultures of our organizations often, to some extent, mitigate against that. So again, this is an opportunity through this crisis is to show that we can work from home, we can work in more flexible ways, and that should be something that we take forwards into whatever emerges after this crisis. And it's not to say that everybody should work from home, obviously, but it is to recognize that we can work more flexibly. And we can, by doing that, give more people more opportunities to work in these different ways, to balance the different needs of their lives, hopefully to reduce stress, and to find that indeed, work is not all dictated by just being at work, or in a place of work, I should say. But I think the other thing that we're also learning, and this is perhaps part of the peculiar circumstance of all of this, is that actually the social side of work is really, really important. Human beings are social animals at the end of the day. And what has also been encouraging in terms of what we've observed, and what we'll talk a bit more about in this webinar, is that through this time of remote working and home working, we have found all sorts of different ways to connect, all sorts of different ways in which we can check in with people, all the ways in which we're asking people how they're feeling, all the ways in which we're using technology, not just to work, but to keep connected socially. And I think that is also a fantastic recognition of what is important about work, that it is not just what you do, it's how you connect, how you create social connection, and how you create healthy and supportive cultures, which are the absolute root and basis of well-being. So that's probably enough for me just in terms of context. So we got some great contributions. Obviously, Carrie and his team, we've worked with a great deal over the years on the subject of well-being, and we've been issuing guidance on remote working and how to support remote working teams. And Carrie's going to take us through some of that. And then we'll hear from Helen in some very direct examples of how they've been dealing with it at Ogilvy. So Casey, I'm going to hand back to you just so you can facilitate the conversation and then perhaps pass on to Carrie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that really great context setting. So Kerry, I always feel when I introduce you, this is a man that needs no introduction when we're talking about all things well-being. So if I could hand over to you to give a sense of what organisations should be doing to support health and well-being remotely.
Thanks, Katie. Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody, at lunchtime. Can we have the next slide, please, Katie? That's great. What I did is I've broken it down into two bits. One of the bit is tips for you as a remote worker, and then tips about what you might consider managing people who are working remotely. Now, some of these you think look kind of silly, get dressed in the morning. But guess what? I just talked to somebody who actually did not a video remote, not a Zoom remote meeting, but did it by audio. And he had his PJs on while he did it. I was talking to him. I said, don't do that. Get dressed, start the day. This is Monday to Friday. The other thing about finding a suitable place to work, you think that's obvious, finding a suitable place. But the Institute of Employment Studies found last week in a big survey they did that there was a massive increase in musculoskeletal problems, backache and so on, because people weren't finding the right places to work and everything else. So think about the right space. But I think what's really important in this area is having a routine of one sort or another. Now, this routine is going to be weird because we have those funny little things running around our house called children. Quite a few of you have children. So there's homeschooling going on. There's two people, 2 out of every 3 families are working families. So we have 2 people trying to do their work. Who's going to do what? So planning a routine, I think, is really quite important. It may mean, by the way, you can't do a 9 to 5, because if you're doing 3 hours of homeschooling, one of you in the morning and the other one in the afternoon or something like that, one of you or both of you may have to work at night. So, but there has to be some kind of structure. People, I think, need that kind of structure. When it comes to setting the ground rules, I call it, like the military call it, rules of engagement. I think these are really important, establishing roles. By the way, here's where I think we could really gain from this. Assigned, as Peter said, flexible working, I think is now going to happen, big time. A big study I did years ago with working families found that men didn't apply for flexible working because they felt that that would show that they weren't committed to the organization. So now we can see now the technology is available. Wouldn't it be nice? The other thing we could learn is not just flexible working, but maybe men should be playing a more substantial role in the family than they have in the past. I don't think they have played a major role. The evidence is clear that we have a new man, but I think he's in Aberdeen at the moment touring the country. So I think we need more, we need men to think about the role vis-a-vis home and work as well. So in the course of having structure, staying active, exercise, every morning from 7 to 9, my wife and I get out, we walk 2 miles, a mile one way and a mile back through a farm. And you need to have exercise sometime during the day, either early, lunchtime, or in the evening, but you need the exercise. So that's really important. So staying physically active, but also cognitively active, by the way, I think is also quite important, which means that you might consider doing something different that you haven't done. The reality is our in-tray won't be that full. It just won't be. And because it's not that full, and because you're not commuting, you have disposable time. So learn a language. Think about something to do with work that you need, that you hadn't had time to think about before, something novel, some new product, some service, something about it, or learning a language or whatever. So keeping physically active, but cognitively active as well. And then I have down here on my list, news junkie, please stop watching the news. Do the 6 o'clock news, get 15 minutes of what you need to hear about, and stop it. Because you know what? It's just constant negative drip, and it is affecting people emotionality. I've been talking to my neighbors on the road, of course, physically distancing. By the way, something Peter said is important. Whoever came up with the notion of social distancing doesn't understand human behavior. They should say physical distancing, but social connection. That's really important. So I think staying away from the news a bit, staying connected, and that means social contacts. That doesn't mean just your work contacts. Of course you do. The colleagues, the people you like. Don't go to the people who are glass half empty types. Stay with the people you like. You have to be connected with, and avoid the people who are kind of negative. In life, we always get those kind of people. But staying connected, I think, is important. That's a way you can kind of take control of things. And the reason I say email is not always the answer, I'm very worried when we do emails, we sometimes, because it's so telegraphic, say things we regret saying. And when you're in an office, you can try to deal with that eyeball to eyeball. But to be honest with you, when you're working remotely, it's very difficult to do it. Be very careful what you say to people on email. Anything that is potentially high risk, or there's a potential conflict associated with it, don't do that. Call them up or do FaceTime. Do it some other way. Try not to do it by email. I think that really is a problem. And the last one's reflecting on your work life. By the way, I think a lot of people are doing that right now. I've talked to colleagues and neighbors and people, and they're all saying, what's my career really like? You know, what should I do with my job? Are there other things I should do? We have reflection time. Use it. We don't use it. This is a real opportunity to link with your family and have work-life, not balance, but work-life integration, because we will be working more flexibly in the future. Peter's 100% right. And we may have different priorities now, and let's think about those priorities. Gives you an opportunity to do that just as an individual. Am I in the right job? Sorry to say that, but people will be reflecting on it. Am I in the right sector? Is there something else I'd like to do? You know, this gives us an opportunity, I think, to reflect on life. So those are just some kind of tips about what you might do, just for you as a person. But can we do the next slide? That's great. Now, this is about trying to manage people more remotely and how you should do it. Now, put safety first is it's the same thing about looking at your office space as an individual. This is you responsible for your team who's working remotely. Do they have everything they need? Do they have printers? Do they have paper to print off? Think about all those kinds of things. Do they have a desk somewhere? Do they have appropriate, because you know, what the IES found, that musculoskeletal problems were really very, very high, as well as emotional problems, by the way, stress as well, work in those conditions. And again, just like with the family, you're trying to organize your day in some kind of routine. I think the same thing applies to step away from your desk. Just means, you know, have a day, you know, make sure you have a lunch. Do you know, before, you know, pre-COVID-19, people's average lunch was 22 minutes at their desk, right? Well, why do that? You have more disposable time, have lunch, have it with the family, you know, have a break, go in your garden, take a walk, get outside, but don't burn yourself out, because I think that is a real worry in this, that people are so insecure that they're going to work through everything and work into the night, and we really need some kind of structure. Woody Allen said something really interesting. He says, I don't want to achieve immortality through my work. I want to achieve it by not dying. So I think it's really important not to burn out. And that is a real problem that we could have. Minimizing stress, that means you set the expectations of what you want, and make sure everybody understands it, and don't set expectations that are too high and too stressful at this point in time. You know, in any case, to be honest with you, we don't have as much work to do. But setting the expectations gives people the autonomy that actually the lockdown is imposing on us in any case. You know, we're by ourselves, we have to manage this thing. This is a good opportunity for managers to learn how to give people control and autonomy and not to micromanage. I think that's really quite critical. Having a virtual daily huddle that's coming together as a group, that's happening a lot. I think I've seen that in all the meetings I've been involved in, the people I've talked to, and looking at the surveys that are coming out. We're holding a lot of team meetings. It might be difficult, by the way, in the team meetings to actually get a sense of what people are actually emotionally feeling. I'm kind of worried about that. I think the evidence, again, from the IES is that there is a lot of stress around, a lot of worry about, will my job be there when I get back? Will, you know, it's just job insecurity, financial insecurity, and all of that. And this is not even talking about furloughing, which is another big issue, and how you manage that. I think in those scenarios, by the way, as a manager, be very careful how you explain to people when they're being furloughed, why they're being furloughed, and being honest about it, because they're going to wonder why I've been furloughed but Fred isn't. And you have to be really honest, and it's probably because Fred can deliver the revenue, and he can do that because of the nature of the role. Your role doesn't deliver the revenue, but and then think about what you can do to make them feel valued, that their job is more secure. And that is all about, in my view, about, for example, if you can afford it, you pay the additional 20%. I think that's really important. It's showing you value them. So the 80% comes from government, you pay the 20%. Or alternatively, if you can't afford the 20%, the other option you could do is you could say, I will, once we're up and running again and things are okay and the bottom line is coming through, then we'll make your salary up to the way it should have been. Something that shows that you value them. My worry in this regard, by the way, is this requires very good social and interpersonal skills, a lot of EQ and emotional intelligence. You have to use it. If managers have nothing else in this scenario to learn, that is probably the most important thing you now have in your armory. And if you don't have it, get it. Get some training or whatever, because you need it. Because you're dealing with people who are working remotely. You're dealing with people who are feeling insecure. You're dealing with people who are a bit stressed. A lot of uncertainty and the like, and that means you have to communicate a lot. And that's about fostering relationships. So in the fostering relationships is you can have your huddles and get together, but what is really important is you do one-to-ones. If I was a line manager, every single day I'd get in touch with every one of my direct reports, unless I had 100 of them. If I have direct reports, you should be touching them every day, but not about their work necessarily. And that, again, requires social skills, because you don't want them to feel you're micromanaging them. That's the critical thing. What you want to do is find out how they're feeling. And, you know, this has got to be done visually, because people unconsciously, through their body language, their facial expression, and the like, tell you what they're feeling. And you should open it up. And the way you open it up, by the way, in fostering relationships, is you be vulnerable yourself. Tell them how you're feeling. Don't hide it. You know, don't try to be the strong man or woman. Show your vulnerability, and people will be vulnerable and will tell you how they're really feeling. You know, because we all are feeling strange under these circumstances. There's no way any of us feel this is normal behavior, and the uncertainty on how long it's going to go. So be vulnerable. That helps to foster relationships. The big picture, and be prepared to flex, but I think everybody is flexing now. But as a manager, you have to show that you're flexing as well, that you're being fairly adaptable. You expect other people to do it. But I think the setting expectations and trusting your colleagues is a real opportunity for us. We've been talking a long time about people not feeling they have control and autonomy over their job. And that, by the way, is a leading cause of stress. And remember last year, HSE report, in terms of sickness absence, long-term sickness absence, the large bits, 57% of all sickness absence last year was due to anxiety, depression, and stress. Can you imagine what that must be now? If that was before, that was pre-COVID-19. So allowing people autonomy, trusting them, checking up on them by not checking up on whether they're delivering or not, you'll know that anyway, but how they're feeling, valuing them, making it, and particularly, by the way, people who've been furloughed, you should be calling them up too. Do not let them, do not leave them alone. They're going to be feeling insecure enough. Please call them up, keep in touch with them. Get them involved in meetings that you're having. There's nothing wrong with that. They can't do the work by law, but they can attend the meetings, the huddles, any meetings you have. And that's about being kind and caring about people. And you know what? What I have found that's really enlightening for me is how most of the meetings I've been involved in, how people have been more open and revealing their feelings much more because they're doing it in the home context. They're talking about kids and they're talking about a whole load of things. You know, I was in a meeting where somebody was talking about a relative having cancer and treatment and worried about whether they're going to get the treatment and they're in the middle of it. You know what I mean? So it's being human and being kind. And really the discouraging presenteeism is people will, when they're feeling insecure, as quite a few are, they will tend to work longer hours. They will be sending you emails or stuff at 10 o'clock at night. Try to discourage it. And if they're feeling ill, tell them not to work. Right? That is really important because I'm worried about that. People who are worried about it will say, well, I got to work. I got to show them I'm active, even if I'm not feeling very well. If you're not feeling well, take the day off. Just don't try to be a presentee. We don't need that. And I think the other thing is, if you sense in your one-to-ones with your staff, the people, your team, that there's one or two who really don't seem to be coping terribly well, make sure you know what resources are available to you from HR, from your organization. Because EAPs can be done eyeball to eyeball through virtual platforms. You know, EAPs being the counseling service or whatever. So know what support is around for your employees if you sense there's a problem. You are not a counselor. You can listen to people, but if you think somebody's really suffering, point them in the right direction and do it. But I think on balance, let's learn from this. Let's give people more control and autonomy over the job. That'll make them more job satisfied. Let's trust them. Let them decide their own kind of routine. Let's make sure we don't overstretch them. We don't need to do that at this point in time. And make sure relationships are good in the team. Make sure you're seeing the team all the time and one-to-ones with everybody frequently. And I think we'll get there. We'll get out of this. There's no question about it. We could get out of this and learn a hell of a lot. We could be working much more flexibly. People will have more autonomy. And I think if we treat them well and are kind and humane, we can all benefit and maybe have tighter teams and better working and more efficient teams. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kerry. Really insightful as ever. I have to say, doing these webinars is giving me a reason to get dressed and even put on some makeup when I'm doing them. So I'm definitely getting into a bit of a routine. I'm going to hand over to Helen now, and Helen's going to give an example of how all this is working in practice at Ogilvy and really bring to life how they're supporting their employees. So over to you, Helen.
Thank you. So when I was asked about the case study for this, it's been quite, I was getting my head together in terms of what we have been doing, and I'm quite pleased with the shape we've got into. It's not perfect, we're still building, but I'm really happy to share with you what we've been doing from a practical point of view. So we, as many other businesses did, we had a practice day just before we were anticipating that this might happen. So we had a practice day where the whole business worked from home, and this was so that we could not just test our IT capability and our ways of working in terms of team working, but also so that we could really test out how people felt and how people's mental health was and the impact on that. We then very quickly did a very quick and dirty survey monkey for everyone so that we could do some quick learnings from that. We galloped ahead because the very next day was the day when we decided that everyone should work from home. So that was the Monday, I think, before any official advice. I then worked with our behavioural science team. They're part of Ogilvy Consulting, and obviously I'm really lucky that I can lean into that team. So I shared with them some guidelines for staff and managers, and I'm really chuffed because, Carrie, I think we got most of yours in there some way, slightly different language, but I was really pleased to see that we weren't off beam. So we worked together on those and collaborated, and we broke those down into we were thinking, what do we need to be effective and our best selves? We wanted to align these to our Thrive programme to ensure staff wellness during this time, both from a mental and physical point of view. So we broke this down into happy, healthy and productive. We then worked with that team to think of some behavioural nudges and some ideas from each. And actually, this is totally free to download if anybody wants it. Just either look me up on LinkedIn or Ogilvy, or I can share the link with Katie. But we decided that it was totally free for anyone who would like to access it. So under each was a series of nudges and ideas. During this time, we were also very quickly building a Craft Academy SharePoint. So Craft Academy is our learning and development offering for Ogilvy UK staff, and we very quickly built a sort of beta version on a SharePoint. We managed to do that in 4 days. My apprentice was amazing. And on there, we've put all of our remote learning opportunities, we've put free stuff, we've put all our resources, we've put curated articles, helplines for domestic violence, all of that stuff that we wanted to make accessible to staff when they're not in the office. We are updating, my team are updating that every day. Some of it might be stuff like yoga for kids or tips for homeschooling, which is a term I keep really struggling with because I have an 11-year-old and a 13-year-old. I'm not doing any homeschooling. I'm working full time. The 13-year-old's maths is way beyond me. So I'm not going to pretend for 1 second that I can homeschool. So I think we need to be really kind to ourselves. So we've whacked a load of stuff on our Craft Academy SharePoint. We also brought forward our launch of Unmind, which is the partnership that we've chosen for our wellbeing platform. We were working with Unmind and we were originally launching to coincide with Stress Awareness Week, but we pulled that forward with a little bit of a push to make sure that we could give it to staff as quickly as possible and give everyone access. So sort of week 2, there was a big push on using Unmind. It's not just about mental health, but initially we were pushing the mental health side. But it's also got really great access to articles. It's got great access to stuff around physical health, sleep. I'm not sleeping well, and I know it's impacting on me. So, I've been using that resource quite a lot. We then surveyed again. We're just waiting on those results, but we wanted to do a pulse survey to see how people were. The feedback from the remote working guide had gone down really well. And the feedback for the Craft Academy SharePoint had gone really well. We're now waiting to see, sort of 5 weeks in, how people are. And we coincided that in part because all of the feedback from APAC, who've obviously been ahead of us on this, was very much that week 5 is a massive dip in remote working in this way. So last week was week 5 for us. So we pushed even more sort of remote yoga, some fun stuff that people could engage with. And I'll come back to that in just a second. In terms of key behaviours that we've taken through from thinking about our remote working guide, we've been encouraging line managers to use form score. And what I mean by this, and you can see more about this in the guide if anybody wants to look at it, is and I'll bring it to life by telling you how I use it. So every morning I have a huddle with my team, and we all give our form score, which is your score out of 1 to 10. And it's effectively checking in on everyone's mental health. The reason why I love this is because even the quieter people, the introverts on a call, can be heard. It also gives us, so it's really inclusive, it also gives us if there are any warning triangles. So if someone's form score is low, then if someone else's score is higher, I will ask that person's with the higher score to scoop in if I can't, or if, for example, I think it's going to make that team member feel uncomfortable if it's me scooping in. So I think we were only in week 2, and that flushed out that 4 of my team their other halves had lost their jobs already. So clearly they were under immense pressure, and we were able to scoop in and to give them as much support as we possibly can. It also gives you the opportunity just to have a virtual cup of tea. We have reiterated the need for contracting as a team. So my team now has a flow, and I know each team across the business, we work in what we call crafts. Each craft has contracted in terms of ways of working. And to Carrie's point, for example, if you've got someone who is tag teaming because they've got smaller children, if they are then emailing late into the evening because that's their free time, that actually impacts on people that have probably already done a full day's work. So by doing that contracting piece about what are our core hours, we will not get back to emails after. So we implemented a policy that we've been working on for some time. Again, we brought that forward, which we're calling the right to disconnect. And this is basically saying, you know, we've all got our smartphones, we've all got so much going on, but as long as you're working between the core hours, and working, we don't mean presenteeism, we just mean available if you need to answer a question urgently. And even what does that look like? So what do we use Zoom for? What do we use email for? What do we use WhatsApp for? So we all have a shorthand, and it's already brought the noise down. Week 1, I'm not going to lie, we were all headachy, zoomed out. I couldn't understand why anyone would want to get on Zoom at the weekend for quizzes, because I was just like, so we've done that piece of contracting, lots of lessons learned, and things have definitely settled. In terms of communication, my mantra always is you can never over communicate, and never more so than now. We've put in place a cadence for our internal communication. So every Monday, for example, is a Thrive Day for comms. So that's checking in with mental health. It's reminding people about Unmind. It's reminding people about the various places that they can find counselling. Wednesday, we have a push to those who are people leaders or people managers, again with a series of nudges or a series of reminders. So for example, you know, to deal with microaggressions just as you would in the office. For example, that was one of the ones last week. So just because someone might be late to a meeting, it could be that they've got a crying baby in the other room. So to not pull it out and to not embarrass people, and to just be kind. We've also pulled together some specific guides. We initially started, as I'm sure every business did, with guidance for parents working at home. We then extended that with carers, and last week we published our guidance for teams and for managers and for individuals in terms of for those who live alone, because I think they've been forgotten. We've also pulled together a number of guides and resources for grief, and not just for the obvious grief, but also change. So we've got a podcast that we're just putting together this week where we're working with a grief expert, and that will again be put on Craft Academy for anybody that would want to listen in. And we're just reiterating that staff are letting you into their home in this time, and not everyone is going to be 100% comfortable with that. I'm going to be honest, my house is a tip and it's not showing any signs of improvement. So where everyone's saying, I'm going to do this, and even my sister who lives in Sydney, it's like, I've cleaned the house top to bottom. I haven't done that. So right now I've got a screen on, you can see my virtual background because I'm in my daughter's bedroom. It's reminding managers, you are being let into someone's home. Don't pass comment on it. Be kind. Remember to check in. So again, to Carrie's point, check in daily. I had an example where someone hadn't even spoken to his PA for a week, and it's just like, what are you thinking? So we've been doing an awful lot of that, nudging, pushing, and to be honest with you, I'm using this opportunity to really push the leadership development and people management development whilst we're in this time. So kindness always, and I think our resounding takeaway and most overused phrase will certainly be, you're on mute. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Helen, and that was a timely reminder for me to take myself off mute. Before I come to questions for everyone, I'm just going to ask you, Helen, a specific one that somebody's asked is, could you share some of the things that you asked in your surveys? Some of the examples of the questions.
Absolutely. Off the top of my head, it was things like, do you feel that you've got a safe place to work? Do you feel well set up? We asked the specific question, have you looked at how to set up a good workstation? I'm currently piled up on 2 books to make sure, because I know I was a little bit broken after week 1. So we asked some really practical stuff, and then we asked some questions around, I'm really happy to share, Katie, the specific questions, because I can't remember them off the top of my head, because I'm 51. Some of the questions were around, how does it feel? How happy, how did you feel at the start of the day? How did you feel by the end? This was for the practice. The questions that we sent just now are more in depth. So again, it's asking in terms of a comparison to where we started 5 weeks ago and how you're feeling now. Do you feel, a lot of questions around feeling connected. We have lots of social stuff going on, so we've asked some questions around that specifically so that we can share. So we've got, kind of virtual pub quizzes going on. We've got all of that stuff. So it's all about learning lessons so that we can share and build. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you so much. So I'll put the questions out there and anybody can jump in. Somebody's asked, is there anything that we could recommend for team members who are single and living alone? So people who might be feeling particularly isolated. I'm sure you've all got views on that. Who wants to go first?
We have that is one of the guides that we were just finishing off last week, actually, because I think it is, there's a potential to forget that for those people it's even more isolating. We've actually worked with some of the people in our teams who we know are living alone, and they've been brilliant because they've been able to give us some other insights. And I think it's even more important to check in with those people, and also for them to have a buddy, and also for them to think about, if they fall ill, who's going to look after them and how will we know how they are. So again, that connectivity, and just I think again, it's just reminding managers to really step up on this. But yeah, we have written a guide specifically for that. I think it's important.
You know what worries me, Helen? I think people think that the younger members of your team, the 20-somethings, the millennials, are not going to be troubled by this if they're alone in a flat in London. They will be. They are going to be a very, very high-risk group, in my view. They're much more social. That whole generation is. And I have found that if they didn't, many of them tried to go back home, which was interesting, to go live with their parents during this period of time, which would have been great. But a lot of them got stuck in London. They couldn't get back in time. Yeah. And I think they do need your help. desperately as a manager, you must get in touch. Don't assume that they're young and resilient and they'll be able to cope. Many of them are not, and they are much more social animals than a lot of other generations.
Well, I think that's where our morning huddles have been really helpful as well, because where people haven't shown up, that's given me a red triangle. So I've called them specifically to just check if they're okay. 9 times out of 10, it really has just been that they're on another call. Because to your point about we're all less busy, we're definitely not in the people team. But I think it's a really valid point. My stepdaughter is 26, and we actually fished her out of London for that exact reason. And she was with us for a couple of weeks because we were quite concerned. It's definitely an absolute consideration.
Yeah, I think that the most important thing on all of this is recognizing each individual need, isn't it? I mean, we've often, the paradigm of work so often in the past has been, well, we'll treat everybody collectively, here's our collective HR policies and collective this and collective that. This is a time to really understand the individual members of our teams. And you're right to call out younger people. And we know that in our own workforce, we've got people who are living literally in a bed sit and having to work on their bed with all their papers around them. And that is an incredibly hard thing to do. You've got no boundary then between your work and your not work. But then, of course, others with children, as you said, and all sorts of different circumstances are worried about their older parents. Everybody's got a different circumstance, and it's so important, which is back to this emotional intelligence and keeping connected, understand what we're doing for everybody and how we need to support them. But it's good to hear what you said, Helen. I mean, certainly calling out particular contexts, which we know are quite common, is important. But I think when this started, we were forgetting some of these very basic things and assuming because we might have separate workspace as leaders, so many people don't, and they're all piled together. They got their children, they got their work, all going on in the same workspace, and that is really, really hard to deal with.
One of the things from a previous project that I'd worked on elsewhere, when we'd surveyed when we were going to further remote working, then it was actually the younger people in flat shares that didn't want to remote work.
Yeah.
And I've seen it myself with a couple of my team. When you're in a flat share situation, that's very different, and it's difficult, and people are getting up at different times of the day, and the informality of it. And also, you know, we had an incident last week where one of our older members of staff who lives alone and has absolutely lived for her dog, and her dog had to be put down last week. And I cannot tell you how brilliant people rallied around her, because the minute I found out, I let people know, and we all got our arms around her because I was deeply concerned. That was her one bit of company in this. And I definitely think it's something that, to your point, Peter, there's no one size fits all, but this is where we can step up and treat everybody properly as individuals.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's that very human bit that Kerry was talking about. Kerry, can I put this one to you first? What are your top tips for combating an always on culture during these times, so people feel they can't switch off?
Yeah, I mean, that really is an issue. I like what Helen said. I am really into the right to disconnect. I go along with the French law. I love it. And I think it's very difficult now that we're working exclusively remotely, not to be doing emails. But this gives us an opportunity, given the platforms we have, to talk to people. But we can't. The all-on culture, we shouldn't be all on. We don't have as much work to do. Crazy. Use this time to reflect on what you're doing, to make your connections with your teams. I mean, and the emails, I'm very worried about that. I'm worried about people constantly sending. I'm getting a lot of emails, more than I normally would get. And I think people want to stay connected, but that's not a good way to connect. It's not a good way to connect. And I loved Helen's point about trying, even in this period of time, to say, try at night not to do this. If you're line managers, don't send people emails at night. If you want to send an email to somebody, and you're doing your work at night because of your family arrangements, because you're doing homeschooling or whatever, do it. Don't send it till the next morning. Leave people alone. Because people do feel that they're on, you know, that they have to, it's, you know, and if you're insecure, you're going to do that, aren't you? That's what it's all about. Insecurity drives this workaholism behavior.
Thank you. Andrew, if you're there, could you just take yourself off mute, because there's a little bit of a legal angle to this question. If you've got colleagues complaining about their working conditions, for example, not having suitable desks or chairs, should the company provide them with suitable equipment? Who's responsible for that? And I don't know, Andrew, if you've got any thoughts on that, and maybe Helen, if you could share what you've done around that kind of more physical working space.
Yeah, certainly. Just picking up the point of equipment, it's really a matter for the contract between employer and employee, because I mean, many of us have managed remote teams prior to this crisis, and different companies will take a different approach. Some will provide equipment, some will say go out and buy the equipment you need and we'll reimburse you. The critical thing here, though, isn't so much about who pays, it's the employer's obligation to maintain a safe working environment for their workers, and that applies equally at home as it would in the office. So really that should be at the forefront of your mind, and then making that happen is the important thing. And that's a subject for negotiation, really. And obviously this was sprung on us fairly quickly. People had to adapt very quickly. There wasn't any time to get anything in place in terms of providing equipment over and above the IT that was needed in most cases. But from here, it's a matter for negotiation, but you do have that responsibility to maintain a safe environment. So however you need to get there, you need to make sure that you do in some way.
Thank you. Helen, practically, what did you do around this?
During the first week before the country was on actual lockdown, we were able, there was a core team that went into Sea Container's house, which is what you can see behind me, who did get things like where someone had physically a back issue, for example, so had a special chair. We were able to get some equipment couriered to homes. As we've gone through, we keep reiterating around the DSE, you know, doing your self-assessment around your workstation, and that we can help if we can. But on a practical point of view, if our 800 people in Sea Containers all went and spent £1,000 on equipment, you know, that's putting additional financial pressure. So we've asked people to exercise judgment and common sense. Hence, you know, I mean, I'm kicking myself because when we all left, it was all new territory, right? So I didn't bring home my stand and my keyboard. And I'm kicking myself for that, but equally I've now found a way around that. So we're helping on a case by case, whilst reiterating it is absolutely, health and safety is a statutory right, so absolutely we'll make sure that you're set up to work comfortably and effectively from home.
Thank you. Got a couple of questions. I'll put this to you first, Peter, about how the transition back into an office space will look. I mean, obviously we've said that, you know, we might not be going back to an office 100% of the time, or that might change, but how would you suggest that transition works?
Yeah, it's such an important question. I think, you know, the period leading up to Easter to me sort of marked a move to the next phase in many ways. I mean, as you said, Helen, those first few weeks for all of us, including us at the CIPD, was pretty hectic, trying to find the new pace of work and so forth. But I think we've all started to think much more now about, okay, what does the transition back to whatever the new normals will be? And we need to be careful with the language, first of all, because I've heard people referring to when we go back to work. Well, no, we're all working now, we're just working differently. So the thing is, I think, first of all, is to begin to plan ahead. And of course, I think almost certainly what will happen, not only, as we've all emphasized, is this an opportunity to say, look, we've learned that we can be more flexible, so we don't have to force ourselves all to say, right, even if, you know, somebody waved a wand and said, as of Monday, you could all go back to offices, which I don't think is going to happen. You wouldn't want to force that anyway. So I think, first of all, it's going to be gradual. I think the government almost certainly will be advising a gradual return in whatever form that takes. I think for organizations themselves, we would need to look at it that way as well. And we will need to think about provision in our workplaces, because it's almost certain that even if it starts, say, in late May or early June, when governments have reached the end of these sort of current lockdown periods, that we will still have many reasons to keep distancing, to provide proper safety and support to people at work. We will also have many people, I'm quite sure, will say, you know what, I'm not comfortable going back to work, because I'm not comfortable that even though my work environment might be looking like it's okay, I've still got to travel and I don't want to take public transport. So we're going to have to be, I think, very flexible as we think about the transition to work, but use that in a positive way, which is to say we are not just simply forcing people back to offices. We are allowing much more flexibility. We will allow more flexibility in working hours. We'll allow more flexibility in where and when you might use the office space. And all of those have got to be seen as positive things. And I think that's how we should be thinking about transition. But for us, this is a subject we want to start to talk about a lot more now. We have more webinars on it, talk a lot more now about this transition post the crisis as to what does that begin to look like and how do we plan for it.
Kerry, Helen, have you got any thoughts on this kind of return to work?
Yeah, we're just working on it now, actually. And just to reiterate what Peter said, I was talking about it this morning. My personal view is if anybody feels uncomfortable, we've made this work. So I think we need to take that into account and allow them to work from home for a bit longer if they're not comfortable getting on public transport. Ditto those who might have people that they're sheltering. How does that work? You know, if you're caring for an elderly relative or someone who's immunosuppressed and you're expected to go back to work, you're not going to be able to be in a position to shield. So to Peter's point, I think what our starter for 10 is, we're probably going to do a short survey again, but we're going to time that once we know when we're going back. But at the moment, we're just working out all of the phasing and how we phase, who we phase, and what that looks like. We're also using, many of you will have already been using Onboarder, but we were about to start using Onboarder for new joiners for onboarding. We're actually going to use that to re-onboard everyone. And that's going to be a bit of a test case for us as well.
That's really interesting.
Just tying in with that as well, actually, on what Helen just said, obviously many of the people returning will have protected characteristics, particularly with disabilities, perhaps mental health issues or the like. What looked like a reasonable adjustment before, the extent to which you could reasonably adjust before may look a lot different after this crisis, because it is a huge experiment in home working. It's been proved in many cases it can work. So what may look reasonable in the future will be a much broader category of actions than what it looked like in the past.
I think there's going to be a lot of inhibitions about traveling. First of all, business travel will probably die. You know, long distance business traveling will die. Flying off to New York and the rest of it for a meeting, which is dumb anyway. But even traveling on a train, there's no way you can social distance, or I'm not calling it social, physical distancing on a train. So there's going to be a lot of reluctance about that. You know, if I was an employer, I mean, Helen is likely to have the resources to do this. The SME's less likely. As soon as the antibody test is there, I would offer it to all our employees, all of them. Because you know what? They'll feel much more secure if they know they've actually had it. And you could be much more flexible with the people who haven't had it for a period of the next couple months, because this isn't going away that quickly. So I think that the antibody thing would be worthwhile for employers to invest in. And probably if there was employers, if the CBI and other employer organizations were smart, they'd ask the government for that support to ensure.
I think that's true, Carrie. This is going to break new ground for us as well, though, isn't it? I mean, the amount of information that people will be and perhaps need or willing to disclose about their own personal health, whether they feel they're going to be discriminated against because they have or have not got the antibodies, a whole new ground for us to break on that one as well. But you know, you've seen various companies announcing this. I saw this big announcement from Amazon saying that they wanted to be able to test all their employees. So there are other things that we're going to have to think about as we, because I'm not entirely disagreeing, but it does raise other questions we have to be very mindful of.
I agree.
I'm just going to ask one very quick question. I think I'll just put it to Helen from a practical point of view. Have you had to support any colleagues back to work after actually having COVID-19, and how have you done that?
We have a couple of people who are quite poorly at the moment. So they're not back at work yet. When that time comes, we'll obviously talk to them about a phased return. A friend of mine who doesn't work with us is recovering now, I hope, and she's been so poorly that I can't imagine anybody being able to just race back into work. So again, I think we'll probably use our occupational health provider and work on a solution with anyone that's been really badly affected.
Thank you so much for that. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for this afternoon. I'd like to thank our panel, Kerry, Peter and Helen and Andrew. Thank you so much for your time and your insight. Just to flag that this Friday at 12:30, we're going to be exploring this topic, but from the other side. So we're looking at how HR can support and keep key workers safe and well. So if you're not working from home and your workforce is out doing their jobs as normal, how can you best keep them safe, happy and healthy? You can sign up for that now via the CIPD website and also via our social channels. Just a quick reminder to keep using the Coronavirus Hub on the CIPD website for all your resources needs. Do use the CIPD communities for support. And if you remember, the HR Inform helpline for individual responses to your toughest legal questions. And that's it from us this afternoon. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your questions and engagement. And we will see you next time. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.